What is a total malfunction?
Three types of total malfunction: where you can't find the ripcord, you find the ripcord, you can't pull it, and you find the ripcord, you pull the ripcord, and nothing happens after that.
The time factor is critical with a total malfunction.
Total malfunction requires immediate attention, but in general it doesn't seem that dangerous because you're conscious and capable of reacting to it.
The missing handle. If the pilot chute activation handle becomes dislodged on exit or during free fall, it may be recoverable. If you're above the hard deck, you may have a few seconds for an attempt to find and pull the handle. On the pullout, place your right hand where the bridle exits the container and follow it to the handle. If you're below the hard deck, immediately activate the reserve. A hard pull is caused by a packing error. Make only 2 vigorous attempts to activate the main, then immediately pull the reserve. You must maintain altitude awareness to avoid becoming preoccupied with trying to pull the main. If the main is activated but nothing happens, the problem is probably a pilot chute hesitation, not a total. A pilot chute in tow can be caused by a misrouted hand deploy bridle or an uncocked collapsible pilot chute.
Pilot chute in tow, nasty malfunction, mostly because you can't cut the pilot chute in tow away, so it means you have to pull the reserve.
If the pilot chute in tow is caused by a misrouted bridle, the main will probably stay in the container during a reserve deployment. Immediately activate the reserve at the established hard deck. Don't sit up on deployment, since it increases the chances of an entanglement. If an uncocked kill line pilot chute tows, the results are unpredictable. The pilot chute may work immediately, or on the other hand, it may tow for a while and then suddenly open and lift off. In the meantime, you're losing altitude fast. When you reach the hard deck, pull the reserve. High-speed partial malfunctions.
A high-speed malfunction requires immediate action because you're at freefall speeds and time is critical. You have a partial malfunction if your main canopy has left the container. Remember, if you have a partial malfunction, you must cut away before you pull the reserve to avoid an entanglement.
Horseshoe malfunction is when part of the parachute is attached to you in a place other than the risers. The parachute goes up and back down, and it's tied to your hand or tied to your foot or tied to part of the container system.
A horseshoe can result if the main leaves the container with the pilot chute still in the pouch. This can happen from inadequate bridle retention, or if the bridle is snagged on exit, or if the jumper mistakenly pulls the bridle instead of the pilot chute handle. If the pilot chute is in the pouch, try to extract it and then deal with the result. Here you see the worst possible situation, a horseshoed main that the jumper can't clear. Obviously, a breakaway lessens the chances of a reserve entanglement. However, a horseshoe may not develop enough drag to release the risers or activate an RSL. If you run out of time, your only option is to pull the reserve and hope for the best. The next high-speed malfunction we'll examine is the bag lock.
Bag lock is high-speed malfunction. You're probably with a bag lock. There's maybe just enough drag on a bag lock to stand you up, but not much to slow you down. Once you stand up, you lose the drag of your body and you probably increase your speed. So bag lock sometimes can be faster than a flat and stable terminal velocity. High-speed malfunction, cut it away and pull the reserve now.
If you look up and have a bag lock, this is what you'll see. Don't ever try to correct this problem. You don't have time. Immediately break away and activate the reserve. Failure of the riser or release system is very rare. However, it does happen. If you have a failure, you'll know about it right away. Obviously, there's no way to fix this problem. Immediately break away and activate the reserve.
In a low-speed situation, more time is available to deal with the problem, but the rate of descent is probably higher than normal. Visually check your canopy and do a controllability check immediately after opening. If you do have a malfunction, it's critically important that you maintain altitude awareness. If you're above the hard deck, you can try to correct the problem. If you're at the hard deck, cut away and pull your reserve.
The traditional method of getting rid of line twists is to scissors your legs and kick in the direction to remove the twists while torquing your body in the same direction. Once your momentum builds up, the lines will readily untwist. Of course, the best way to handle line twists is to have the knowledge on how to avoid them.
It's a decision, depending on the amount of line twist that you have and as to whether you're starting to unwind or if you're starting to spin towards the ground. You have to be able to make that decision depending on what you have over your head. You have to make the right decision. If you're in doubt, cut away, trust your reserve.
The line over. During your canopy check, a line over will be quite obvious. Normally, the rate of descent will be arrested to a great extent. This malfunction may require an immediate breakaway and reserve activation. Remember, the first priority is to break away and pull the reserve. If you have time, pull with stability to improve reserve opening reliability. Use the hard deck to establish your priorities.
If one brake line releases, it's going to put you into a spiral. One factor is whether you're spiraling with or without line twists. The obvious thing is to release the other brake and see if the canopy flies properly. If it flies properly and you're with no twists, no big deal.
A pilot chute tangled with the suspension lines is probably not a problem. In fact, with lightly loaded, slow-opening canopies, a pilot chute over the front and snagged on an A-line is not at all uncommon. This may happen during the opening sequence or as the result of aggressive maneuvering. If there clearly is a problem, break away and pull the reserve. On the other hand, if the canopy is stable, is steerable, can be flared, and has a safe rate of descent, it can be landed. Tension knots are probably one of the most common ram air malfunctions. If the canopy opens in a hard turn, there's a good chance you have a problem with the lines. In some cases, the toggles can be used to straighten out the turn while you evaluate the situation. Here you can see the knotted lines on the left preventing that side from fully opening, although the rate of descent is drastically reduced. Since the tension knots are caused by line loading, you will probably not be able to clear this malfunction, and you'll need to break away and activate the reserve. If you open and have tension knots that include either the front and back line groups or the right and left line groups, the slider may be entangled as well. The higher the slider is up the lines, the more the canopy is prevented from fully opening and the higher the rate of descent. Again, you may be able to use the toggles to straighten out the turn while you evaluate the situation. In this case, the jumper has determined that the malfunction can't be cleared and has decided that a cutaway and a reserve ride is the only way to safely handle the situation. If you look up and see this, you don't have a malfunction, you have an end cell closure. After a slow or soft opening, the slider may frequently stop partway down the lines, pulling the canopy in at all the edges. Or the slider may be all the way down, but one or both end cells may not be fully inflated. In any case, pull down the rear risers or the brakes until the end cells inflate. A nose-to-tail split is a major structural failure. This canopy's bottom skin has failed next to the seam which carries the suspension line loads. Although the canopy is flying straight, you can see the leading edges deformed in front of the failed area. A damaged canopy is probably safe to land if it's stable, can be steered, can be flared, and has a safe rate of descent. Carefully monitor your altitude to make sure you stay above the hard deck while you evaluate the canopy's controllability. When you check the handling, make sure the canopy is well behaved during slow flight and during the flare, since you need to do both to land. Although a control problem will be quite evident, determining that the rate of descent is safe for landing may be difficult. If you're jumping a canopy with a high wing loading, it's probably not a good idea to land it. In any event, if there clearly is a problem or any doubt exists, break away and activate the reserve. At first glance, a broken line might be hard to spot, especially if it doesn't seem to immediately affect the canopy's flight characteristics. That's why it's always important to do a controllability and flare check after opening. If you suspect something is not quite right, a closer inspection should reveal the problem. This broken outer A-line is affecting the canopy during the flare, and the jumper has decided to go to Plan B. Remember, if you doubt you can safely land your main, break away and use your reserve. If you have a broken line that's not critical, the flight characteristics of the canopy may seem barely affected at all. In fact, if you jump a docile canopy with a light wing loading, you may not notice any significant change in flight characteristics. In this case, since the canopy is controllable and flares, the jumper has decided to land it. If a steering line is broken, it may be possible to steer and flare using the rear risers, although this might not be a good idea with highly loaded canopies. A simultaneous or near simultaneous deployment may cause both the main and reserve to open.
A dual square situation can develop from an AAD firing, poorly maintained equipment, or a pilot chute in tow that suddenly clears during a reserve deployment. The recommended procedure for each situation depends on each individual set of circumstances. If a compatible reserve is activated following the main parachute deployment and both canopies are open, a biplane is a likely result. The biplane may be fully developed after the main opens, or may result from the reserve opening as it trails behind the jumper. In any event, if the top of the leading edge of the rear canopy is below the trailing edge of the front canopy, the likely result is a biplane. Both canopies will be flying in the same direction with one behind the other, a configuration that seems to be stable and easy to control. If the jumper has directional control, leave the brakes stowed on the rear canopy and fly the biplane using gentle toggle input of the front canopy. Releasing the front canopy of a biplane is not recommended since there is a high probability of the risers fouling the other canopy. Do not flare either canopy for landing. Although the rate of descent will probably be quite slow, even with small, highly loaded canopies, be prepared to do a PLF. If the taller of the two canopies opens in back of the shorter canopy, a side-by-side is the likely result. In fact, the side-by-side is likely to develop any time the top of the leading edge of the rear canopy is above the trailing edge of the front canopy. In a stable side-by-side, both canopies will be flying in the same direction with one beside the other, either with the end-cells touching or the end-cell of the shorter canopy resting against the outside lines of the taller canopy. Note that if the main is the taller of the two canopies in a side-by-side, the main risers pass in back of the reserve risers. Steer using gentle control movements of the larger, dominant canopy. On the landing, don't flare either canopy and be prepared to do a PLF. If the main deploys second and has line twists, the result may be a downplane. This situation is most likely to happen when the reserve is fully open and the main is trailing behind the jumper. In a downplane, both canopies are flying away from each other and toward the ground at a high rate of descent. This is a high-speed situation requiring immediate action. Disconnect any RSL and cut away the main canopy. If the line twists are not severe, the downplane may evolve into a side-by-side on its own. However, if the line twists remain, this is not a good side-by-side to land, and a cutaway is probably the best option. In fact, if the reserve is open and the main is trailing behind, it may be best to disconnect any RSL and cut away the main canopy to avoid the possibility of a downplane. Due to the many variables involved, the results of a simultaneous deployment are somewhat unpredictable. Testing has shown that although in most instances both canopies will open successfully, occasionally a simultaneous deployment could result in an entanglement. If this occurs, try pulling the risers, lines, or toggles to resolve the situation. Be cautious about immediately cutting away the main, since this may complicate the situation. It's important to jump the proper equipment, and this is especially true in a dual square situation. It's easier to fly and land the canopies if they're of similar size. Of course, it's best just to avoid the situation entirely. Make sure your gear is properly maintained and check your equipment before every jump. If an AAD is used, make sure it is properly maintained and is correctly calibrated.
Everything okay?
Then avoid a high rate of descent near the AAD activation altitude. In fact, it's a good idea to establish a buffer zone between your opening altitude and your AAD's activation altitude. How much? That depends on your AAD and your main canopy's opening characteristics.